What happens when urban police forces adopt tactics from military operations? Today, we look at how Israeli army methods are reshaping law enforcement in the U.S. and what that means for democracy and human rights in America. I'm Anelise Borges, and this is The Stream.
You cannot understand what is happening in Palestine unless you understand what's happening to Black Atlanta. You cannot understand what's happening to Black Atlanta unless you understand what's happening in Palestine. We have a daily program based on global international law enforcement exchange. They're sending local police to go train with the IDF.
We have an active exchange program with Israeli police to help train and prepare the future cadre of the police leaders.
They are exchanging knowledge. They are talking to each other.
I visited Israel in 2008 with the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange and was impressed with several practices I saw during my visit, so much so that I implemented several here in Atlanta.
That's why we say Stop Cop City. That's why we say Free Free Palestine. That's why we say Black Lives Matter. That's why we say freedom now.
It's not just the U.S. that funds and supports Israel in its occupation of Palestine. Israel is also offering the U.S. support in policing its own citizens. Israeli surveillance and counter-terrorism techniques are increasingly being used across the United States to, quote, enhance public safety. But critics say they are exacerbating issues of racial profiling and police brutality. To discuss this, we're joined today by some prominent voices on this story. Rudolph Bilal Butch Ware, a professor of African and Islamic history at the UC Santa Barbara, joining us from California. Amanda Seals, an artistic intellectual, joining us from Los Angeles. And Jadelynn Zhang, PhD student at Emory University, joining us from Atlanta. Thank you all so much for joining us here on the stream today. It's a pleasure to have you guys. Amanda, people across the world have been following some of the issues with policing in America. But can I ask you to paint a picture of what's been happening to law enforcement in your country today?
I think on a basic note, we've been seeing the exacerbation of the militarization of the police over the past 10 years. That was really expounded upon during the Black Lives Matter movement, where we saw police in riot gear, we saw tear gas expelled, we saw just a real concerted effort to squash, First Amendment rights of protest. And we've now seen that again in how they have been released to shut down pro-Palestine encampments at schools, divestment encampments at schools, and pro-Palestine rallies. And so you're seeing like police departments for towns that have maybe 43,000 people getting tanks, getting all types of military, riot gear, et cetera. And this is all for the effort of creating these quote unquote cop cities, which are military training grounds that are littered all over the nation. I think, to my knowledge, there's about 68 of them that are planned. Some of them are already breaking ground. Some of them are being built, et cetera. And the effort is essentially to occupy America, which I think a lot of people in America don't seem to really grasp.
And Jadelynn, you were in one of these encampments mentioned by Amanda. Can you describe to us what happened?
Yeah, absolutely. And to echo a lot of what Amanda said, what happened at Emory University's encampment was representative of police militarization in the United States. The encampment had only been up for maybe 2 hours. We were handing out free literature, free food. There was chanting and singing. And then not only the university police, but also the city of Atlanta police and the Georgia State Patrol were brought onto campus and violently took down the encampment and brutally arrested 28 members of our community, including people affiliated with Emory. And the tactics they used were supposedly non-lethal, but they were brutal and they were used with such force that they caused great harm. So it just shows that even the more privileged members of our society these tactics are being used on them. And what we don't see is these tactics being documented, their use being documented on community members who suffer the most at the hands of police brutality.
Were you shocked? What did you feel when those scenes were unveiled in front of your eyes?
I mean, it was horrifying, but I don't think anyone expected that level of force and that level of brutality. And to experience that firsthand is completely different from preparing for that possibility. And I think it just shows the level of militarization that the police are taking on, especially when it comes to, a lot of the people that were arrested were minors. They were not even adults. So this is how they crack down on a peaceful protest. And
we're going to get to the charges that they were actually they had to face later. But Butch, let me turn to you now for the historical context here, if I may, especially in view of Israeli influence on U.S. law enforcement. Where does it come from, and what are the consequences, the implications?
Well, I mean, I love the question because the first thing that I would say is that American policing has always had a dialectic relationship with militarized imperialism abroad, right? Historians more or less agree that there are three essential, cradles for American policing, slave patrols and white militias in the South, the policing of Indian land, essentially Native American lands, conflicts with the indigenous population, and then essentially strike breaking in northern cities, Boston, followed by Philadelphia, then Chicago and other places. So there's a context of American policing that is about how you keep control over stolen people, enslaved Africans, stolen land, westward territories, and then stolen labor. So that has from the beginning placed a relationship between imperial expansion on colonial frontiers and violence and racial repression here in the United States of America. You see that expressed through figures like, Augustin Vollmer, who, serves in the occupation of the Philippines and then becomes chief of police in Berkeley and a university lecturer, right? There's this dialectic relationship between American imperial repression that will eventually inscribe itself here at home. Like the first SWAT teams, right? Special weapons and tactics emerge in the 1960s, and they're essentially borrowing counterinsurgency tactics that are being used in American imperial theaters and now subjecting Black communities to those. So the way that I would, to try to be concise, I would end, my analysis in response to this question with what Huey P. Newton said. Huey P. Newton said that the police in America occupy our communities the way that troops occupy a foreign country. So Israel is just the latest iteration of American imperialist experiments then being brought home to terrorize and brutalize, especially Black and brown bodies, whether in poor communities or largely on campuses, let's be honest about it, and also to engage explicitly in class warfare, right? So I can talk more about kind of the expansions of cop cities as we get further into the conversation, but that's what I would give as an initial historical sketch.
It is a very bleak picture that you paint, but it's a very interesting point. When it comes to the Israeli army, we're talking about an institution that has been cited by human rights organizations, but also by the US government for carrying out unlawful killings, including extrajudicial executions, using ill treatment and torture, including against children, suppressing freedom of expression and association, and using excessive force against peaceful protesters. Here's Amani Ibrahimi with more.
Have you heard about Mini Gaza? It's basically a ghost town in the middle of the desert, where Israeli soldiers train for urban warfare. The simulation city, which is located in the south of Israel and costs tens of millions of dollars, by the way, has 600 buildings, including schools and mosques that even broadcast the call to prayer. Soldiers there carry out combat exercises, usually down narrow streets with walls covered with messages like Free Gaza and portraits of Palestinian fighters, not painted by Palestinians though, but all painted by the Israeli army's official graffiti artist. But while this is happening in the Middle East, you might not be surprised to learn that US law enforcement officers are also being trained in these camps in Israel. According to Jewish Voice for Peace and researching the American-Israeli alliance, the exchange facilitates a transfer of tactics including police violence and control, mass surveillance, racial profiling, and even the suppression of protests and dissent. Since 2017, there has been a huge push to end what is being called a deadly exchange, but there's been little success with that. So, with the spotlight currently on police brutality at student encampments across the US, we're seeing more and more people calling for the divestment in Israeli military training. By deploying the same tactics, critics could say it's one and the same institution.
Amanda, how come US forces are getting away with drawing lessons from such an institution, you would say?
Well, who's going to just challenge them? I mean, the reality is that so many Americans have come to believe that policing is the key to their safety. And that is really something that I think is going to shift as we see more Americans outside of Black and brown people faced with the realities of the terror of the police. And I think that was a wide awakening for a lot of what was going on in the encampments. When you see, you know, elder white women professors being struck to the ground, it's like, well, hold on now. This is a very different version of what we're used to seeing with policing that definitely has a habit of protecting the white elites and just white, not even the white elites, y'all, just the whites. So, you know, they always say it's the complexion for the protection. So I think that's why it is continuing to get support and garner support, but also because the government officials in this nation, I think a lot of people don't understand that it's really about preserving power over the populace. And that is what Butch was saying. And so policing allows the government to put the preserving of the power over the populace in the hands of the police without it looking like it's them, right? It's not like they're deploying the National Guard or deploying the military. But if you can militarize the police, which essentially are supposed to be this like citizen-run, state-run organization, then you are essentially creating a whole other army to do what you need to do in terms of keeping people in place while you displace people.
But you want to weigh in.
And increasing. Yeah, to underline Amanda's excellent point. I mean, increasingly in the really since the 1960s, federal funds have been applied to policing and essentially have like militarized this force, and it's always served that same basic function of control. Like a lot of professors. I'm a history professor, taught on university campuses for the last 20 years. A lot of professors were surprised or shocked by this kind of repressive treatment. I wasn't. My father was a locksmith with a sixth grade education. The only pictures that I have of him in suits are when he is going to court to try to stay out of jail for beatings that the DC police gave him. I was stopped 17 times for driving while Black before my 18th birthday, living in the city of Minneapolis, and had an officer pull his service weapon on me when I produced my identification about 6 blocks away from where George Floyd would later be murdered. So these are not unfamiliar tactics for Black and brown communities, but they are now they're being extended increasingly to campuses. And we saw this in the 1960s as well. And a large portion of this kind of increased militarization and investment in the militarization of the police came with the fact that in the 1960s, it wasn't just Black and brown kids anymore that were protesting the police and protesting the imperialist establishment. So we're in for another era that will look like an escalated version of what we saw in the 60s.
Very interesting. We come full circle. Jadelynn, again, you were in those protests, Emory, and what was unique about Emory was that these protesters were seeking transparency about and divestment from Israel, but also from that $109 million police training center known as Cop City. Can you tell us more about that project and about how it affects your community, the community you're part of?
Yeah, absolutely. And with Cop City and Atlanta, the connections between Palestine and Atlanta are even more salient, especially since Cop City here is modeled off of mini Gaza, which Israeli forces use to train their army and their military to kill Palestinians and engage in the genocide of Palestinians. Here in Atlanta, those tactics, those weapons, that knowledge is exchanged through the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange Program, which is housed at Georgia State University. So there are connections not only between different state entities, but also between different institutions such as universities. So universities are not neutral spaces, which is why they have always been spaces for protest, especially student protest. They've always been spaces for protest against apartheid as well, which was one of the demands of our encampment. We demanded for divestment from Israeli apartheid, as well as pulling support from Cop City. And Emory University administrators sit on board positions at the Atlanta Police Foundation, at the Atlanta Committee for Progress. And these are all organizations that endorse the building of Cop City. And like Amanda was saying earlier, the Cop City in Atlanta is not the only one being built. It's also not the only one being planned in the US.
In terms of how this fits into the context of Israel's war on Gaza, Butch, I watched an interview where you said that it's clear that the October 7th attack and what followed have undone 70 plus years of Zionist propaganda in now 8 months. It exposed Israel's true actions, intent in Palestine. Would you say that it also did that in the US, and what we're witnessing now is part of that?
Without any question, Operation Aqsa Flood, if it accomplished nothing else, poured cleansing waters over people's understandings in the West. Most young people especially now understand Zionism for what it has always been. And for me, the kind of broader context of like understanding that, and I think it's important to include this in the conversation, my access point to like understanding Palestinian liberation and the struggle for freedom and what this kind of repressive violence against Palestine more broadly, not just Gaza, is really about, is that Zionism is in and of itself a facet of white supremacist violence. And this is hard for some people to wrap their heads around, but it wasn't hard for me. Malcolm was one of the first people that taught it to me. He wrote a piece called Zionist Logic in 1964, where he talked about the corrupted logic of Zionism in his own personal notes, his diaries. When he traveled to Khan Yunis and to other places, he explicitly said, this is a white Jewish population being empowered by white colonial powers to take away land from indigenous brown Arabs in their homeland. So Malcolm saw Zionism as white supremacy, and he wasn't the only one. Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture depicted it in that way. Angela Davis depicted it in that way. James Baldwin said, the state of Israel was not created for the Jews. The state of Israel was created for the salvation of Western interests. Okay, so the Black radical tradition more broadly has always understood the Palestinian liberation struggle as an anti-imperialist struggle against white supremacy. So if you sort of seize that and understand where we are, and not, by the way, not just the African-American Black tradition, right? Thomas Sankara, a great African intellectual and leader assassinated, Nelson Mandela. So the Black tradition more broadly has always framed Zionism as essentially an Ashkenazi project aided by European imperialism, and not even an Ashkenazi project, but a Zionist project driven by Ashkenazis. And so therefore, the resistance to that is something that has been understood by the Black radical tradition as a whole to be mandatory and to be intimately connected with the emergence of the carceral state here in the United States, that these are part of a single struggle. Like in Angela Davis's excellent book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle, she talks about many of the corporations that profit from private-run prisons in the United States are the same ones that build border walls on the southern border, that build and maintain the checkpoints and walls in so-called Israel. G4S, to name one of them specifically, right? Either the second or the third largest corporation in the world, runs all of those repressive imperialist carceral projects. So many of us see it as our responsibility to struggle against those at home and abroad, because indeed they are interconnected at home and abroad, not just through the history of policing and the militarization of the police, but indeed through the way that the carceral state itself functions to continue as an extension of slavery. This is the last thing I want to say in this particular point, is the 13th Amendment wasn't the only place where there was an explicit connection between the abolition of legal slavery and the criminalization of Black people, where the United States then says slavery is now illegal except as punishment for a crime. In South Africa in 1835, when slavery was abolished there and the Afrikaner population started what they call the Great Trek, they said we have to keep mechanisms in place that will control crime. As soon as you lose the capacity to enslave people of color and to control them through traditional settler colonial genocidal mechanisms, then criminalization of people of color is the next technique.
You also said something very interesting in terms of the potential for the end of this system, of everything that you're just describing, the end of this empire, let's put it that way. You say the empire is dying under the weight of its own moral depravity. We just have to give it a push. Amanda, your thoughts on this? I mean, are we seeing the beginning of the end of this model because people can't take it anymore? And what awaits, in your opinion?
Well, I think the reality is that a lot of people didn't know what they didn't know. And there's this, I don't know, there's this idea that people don't care about other people. And that's why I feel like empathy has been the biggest effort to kill in order to maintain imperialism. And what we're seeing is that folks are waking up not just intellectually, but empathetically in being able to connect with each other and say, well, I'm just not okay with that. Even if it has nothing to do with me, I'm just not okay with that. And then we're able to see interest convergence when it's like, oh, wait, this does have something directly to do with me. And this is beyond just Palestine. This is with the Congo. This is with Sudan. This is with Tigray. And so people are starting to make connections about people in terms of a global experience of humanity. And that has been what imperialism has worked really hard to disintegrate. So now that we're seeing that, that is the beginning. Someone asked me yesterday, what will this time be looked at? What do we feel like this time will be called in the future? And I said, I think it's going to be called the beginning of the fall. Because once you start seeing folks not just waking up, but becoming voraciously curious for compassion, that is the driving force that is going to create change. And we have seen this in the past, and there are always efforts that are, done to suppress. But now more than ever, people have, I think, a level of information that is actually being able to meet their emotion. And that's never been able to really be exercised. But we're starting to see that. Even in America, this election is going to be so unique because this is the first time people are actually voting with their minds and their hearts. And that hasn't been a thing. But we had a pandemic and people were stuck in the house and people had to get, in touch with themselves. And you're seeing a literal country that has been under the weight of narcissism starting to have an awakening outside of that and start seeing each other and not just seeing themselves. And I know it may seem idealistic, but I do believe that that is really the beginning because it starts with our souls.
You bring so many interesting points there, and I thank you for bringing Congo and Sudan to the conversation as well, and the U.S. election and all that. We're almost out of time, though, so I want to bring Jadelynn back in. As a student and as a young activist, what do you plan on doing to continue fighting for a more just police and society?
Well, I think the only wrong thing to do is to not do anything. There was a quote on the bottom that there are no inappropriate ways to protest. And I think that is absolutely true. I think there needs to be more efforts made to educate each other. And I think that's why political education is a tool for dismantling hegemony and for dismantling these institutions. So I think continuing to speak up, continuing to protest are all ways that everyone can continue to engage in the struggle.
Really well put. Jadelynn, Amanda, and Butch, thank you so much for joining us here on the stream today. It's been a real pleasure having you. And thank you all for watching. Don't forget to stay in touch with us on social media. You can use the hashtag or the handle AJStream to send us your feedback, your suggestions. We'd love to hear from you. Take care, and I'll see you soon.